Alright, this video I'm doing something a little special. Usually when I talk about a topic, I'm developing my thoughts as I'm speaking, mostly. This one is something I just thought through for I don't know how long exactly, but it was like 15, 30 minutes. Um, and I'm doing this by memory, which is kind of a weird thing because usually when I process something, I forget the details. Just part of who I am. But this is so juicy in my opinion that it's like I have to make this video because it's like holy crap, dude. Okay, so the unifying theory of society, culture, civilizational rises and falls, uh, biology, um, one man, one woman versus sexual looseness, and natural selection, and in the lens of trying to maximize cooperative and healthy for as many people as possible things while acknowledging that Mother Nature is a cruel mistress. Now, it's slightly based on the selfish gene in a sense, but I feel like this is an explanation of the mechanism by which humans become higher creatures than chimpanzees, at least, and a possible explanation for why species where the male takes a part in parenting um, have the males typically stronger, smarter, and more driven than the females. Okay, here goes. So basically, what goes on is um, men are expendable in a sense, and this is like the axiom, the foundational building block of this principle, the starting point that everything derives from. Like, just with humans, for example, and this works with chimpanzees as well, by the way. But if there's 100 women and 1 man, you can have 100 children in a year. Let's say you started with 100 men and 100 women, and 99 of the men died. You could have 100 children in a year, and 20 years later, there will be 50 men or 51 men and 150 women, roughly speaking, you know. So there will be an evening out of the sex ratio between men and women again after most of the men died. If you had 100 women or 100 men and 1 woman, that woman would only have 1 child per year. So you'd be at 102 people. And it could be a boy or a girl, so you're not really sure whether you're increasing the rate of having kids again after so many people died off. This hard logic, with women as the gatekeepers of reproduction, is the building block of everything that comes from it. It's sort of just an obvious thing. It's just a fact of nature in humans. We just know it happens. So we don't need to argue too much about the exact details for this part. But what this means is the men are very expendable and disposable from a standpoint of bouncing back the population after becoming nearly extinct. Um, so, men have to face the dangers instead of the woman or children, because children are the future in a way that men and women are not so much, especially when they're very old. Um, this means that there's a natural selection pressure that the strongest, smartest, and most dedicated or driven men succeed. And therefore, the woman evolve from being roughly equal to preferring stronger, smarter, more driven men, instead of giving everyone an equal chance. Which kicks off an arms race where the men are competing with each other for the best woman. And part of a woman's smarts is finding a good man. Because the men take care of the woman who takes care of the child. So the buck stops here, so to speak. The primary total responsibility over everyone belongs to the man. Because the selection pressure is that he's supposed to be smarter and stronger and more dedicated. What this means is, and then there's another thing that happens as well from this, from the previous step, or from this step. I'm not sure which. I think the previous step, where at the same time as what I mentioned just now, it's advantageous evolutionarily for women to give birth to more boys than girls, because you're expecting to lose some of the boys in danger. Which then adds another selection pressure to the men on top of the previous one. Or two even. Basically the woman evolving initially to prefer stronger, smarter, more dedicated men, coupled with the birth of more men than women, so that even if you pair off every woman to a man, there's going to be leftover men, even if all the men survive until adulthood, which they probably won't. What this means is there's a double tap of selection pressures on men in terms of facing danger first and dying first. And there's more men left over than women in picking a partner. Even if you get all the women to pick a partner. So men are competing with the wild animals in fights and stuff, and they die. And men are competing with other men to get access to women to have kids with. Now, the chimpanzees get to this point to some extent. They do have warfare and genocide of the male chimpanzees and so on. The women also evolve advanced mechanisms for determining social compatibility, which I'll get into later, and also a certain sort of caretaking instinct in the men, because if you're the most responsible for protecting and dying and killing for your family, that's literally life or death. And man, you got wild animals and you got other groups of men and other families fighting over the same resources and stuff like that. It's built into nature. You'd better be strong and smart and driven as a man. Or else. And basically, what happens is the woman evolved to prefer strong, smart, driven men, and basically men who can make the woman's life easier in taking care of the child and safer as well. And stuff, useful stuff, like food or tools or rare, shiny stuff, gold, or in earlier times, copper, is an example of you having the ability to provide and make their life easier and safer. And then, what does that mean for evolution and so on? Well, from this set of principles, I guessed, that the Y chromosome mutates faster, more often, than the X chromosome. Now, there's two reasons for this, or maybe three. I think there's two for sure, though. One is, you don't want a majority of people mutating super quickly, because a lot of the mutations can be unhelpful or dangerous to the person with them compared to what's worked before, which is literally what evolution is: mutation and giving it to your children. And then they give it to their children, and it just keeps going and so on. So if you have a mutation that prevents you from having children, or you have a mutation that kills you before you can have children, or something that sets you up for failure in those ways as a man, which is the primary selection method, then that's a crapshoot. But there's extra men, so you can afford the failure of the men, because there will always be a successful man to pick up the slack. Maybe he'll take 2 wives or something. And the truth is, there's already more men, so even if, like, you had 105 men and 100 women, and 5 men mutated in a way that killed them early, then you would have 100 men left over for the 100 women. So the men are more expendable still, and they can mutate in the arms race slightly quicker than the woman. And also, men are XY chromosomes. Women are XX chromosomes, which means 3 out of the 4 possible chromosomes in a human are X chromosomes. What this means is the majority of chromosomes should be relatively stable. So you have something that's stable way more often, and then you have the Y chromosome as the usual experimentation thing. Which is one of the reasons why men started probably roughly equal almost to women, and then at least in humans and chimpanzees, and then eventually got 30% denser muscles and higher cognitive functions and so on. And also a more competitive drive and so on, which is important when you're competing, to just pass on your genes basically to survive into the next generation. Um, now, let me think about where to go next on this, because it was like 45 minutes ago that I thought this up, and it's important. Um, One of the things that happens is that while you have one man, one woman stuff going on, you have a reasonably squished evolutionary selection mechanism on the men. So the men typically are more similar to each other on some levels, or they're roughly equal, even if one's a little smarter, one's a little stronger, and one's a little more driven. Or whatever combination of those things is roughly equal in the end compared to other systems. This keeps more men in the game stably, while also allowing for a certain degree of the weakest die off without having children. So you're selecting out the absolute worst men for society. And remember, they mutate quickly. So they can get worse quicker than women. What this means is, if you get, how do I put this? There is a few technologies. There's basically what I'm going to call mechanical technology and social technology. Now, mechanical technology is literally just the scientific technology stuff we have. Social technology is like ways of thinking about other people or the world and how things generally happen and so on. There is a general drive from physical bodies to mental knowledge. We're getting more and more meta as we develop. And what this means is, how do I do this? There's a certain way to bring this up that makes a lot more sense than if I do it the other way around, I think. Okay, I'll explain the cycles and why they occur first, and then I'll explain the autism relationship and social technologies and so on. Basically, the cycles of history occur because the weak men get it into their head that because the selection pressures have loosened, their primary competition is with the strong men taking all the women, or taking the best women. And at first, because the weak men are kind of equal to the strong men, if they convince the woman to loosen up sexually, then they're more likely to get a good woman. If they have, and they're roughly equal to the strong men. And I don't mean physically strong, I mean just strong in those three categories: physical, mind, or drive. However, as this process goes on of loosening sexual morality, the unfit men get more and more unfit per generation. And there's relatively unfit men and so on. It's kind of like a bell curve that you shift to the left or right a little bit in terms of getting more of them unfit, because you've loosened the selection pressures on the men, and due to the mutations usually being disadvantageous and the men mutating more often, there's like a pattern there. And eventually it gets so bad that, roughly speaking, the woman will, if available, prefer one night with Giga Chad Zeus than an entire lifetime secure in the relationship, not surviving, with soy cuck. They'll prefer one night with Zeus Giga Chad than a lifetime with soy cuck. And the thing about that is, the actual rate is basically the top 20% of guys getting the top 80% of women, which leaves the bottom 20% of women for the bottom 80% of guys. And what happens is, the top 20% of guys get the top 20% of women in a stable relationship, let's say. I'm going to simplify it and just assume this is a rough statistical thing. I'm not going to guess the statistics of the men that sleep with multiple women and impregnate them all, and the men who just sleep around and never settle down. They're just constantly using women and so on. I'm not going to get into statistics with that thing, but they do exist. So basically, the top 20% of guys settle down with the top 20% of women, and then the top 20 to 40% of women, so 21% top, or sorry, the 21% woman to the 40% woman, they are slightly older, and they get with the top 21% of men to 40% of men. Because the prospects of a stable relationship with a half-decent man is actually becoming increasingly good as women get older. But the weaker the man in whatever those three categories I mentioned is, the more she waits, because she's hoping for Giga Chad and so on. And then you have the 41% to 60%, the women are getting older yet again, and so on. And this pattern goes on till 80%, the top 80% of women. And by the time you get to the top 80% of women, basically at some point they get older the lower quality they are when they can get with GigaChad, until before they decide to settle down, and they start getting so old that they can't have children anymore physically, biologically, because they've waited so long holding out hope for a GigaChad, because the man that's equal to them sucks that much more. You see what I mean? They're gambling, basically, because the sure bet sucks in their mind. Now, the bottom 20% of women and the bottom 20% of men, or 40% of men even, actually no, not 40%. The bottom 20% of men and the bottom 20% of women and the bottom 20% of men, remembering that there's about a 5% higher amount of men than women in the 100 to 105 woman to men thing. The bottom 20% of women and the bottom 20% of men get into polycules or polyamory or something like that when the loose and sexual immorality thing's going on. And basically, it's a very low quality woman, very low quality men, and you can get it to the point where there's like 5 guys for a single woman, and the men are basically just so desperate that they're just glad they're getting pussy once a year with a woman at all. They don't mind the fact that they don't have a child with the woman or anything like that. So that represents a dying off of the weak men. I mean, the exact statistics I don't know, but I'm really simplifying it for demonstration purposes. You can probably look into it and find that there's like a more complicated way of putting it, but like roughly speaking, there's a rough pattern similar to what I'm talking about here. Now, the bottom 10% of women might not get any man to begin with, ever. It might be something like that, and the bottom like 10% of men don't either. But like, you know what I mean? It's like, I'm breaking it into 20% sections here for demonstration purposes. Now, what that means is the woman and the men start selecting, or sorry, the men start selecting for younger wives. Then they plunder the next generation of women. And the higher value but not GigaChad men have a higher chance of plundering the next generation of women who are more fertile for longer. And they like to keep the woman. And they're willing to build themselves up to the point where they can keep the woman attracted because she's not spoiled by GigaChad Zeus, Thundercock. So you have a return to one woman, one man becoming more popular because it actually works for people. Because the older men are more wise in the ways of how the world works, and they've got the knowledge and the drive, and they've probably been working on their body for a while, so they're a little more muscly and so on a little bit. Depends on how old they are, how much older they are, but you know what I mean. than when a young adult man starts doing their thing. So that's why older men go with younger women. And it can get more extreme in times when the current generation of women relative to the men aren't very high quality because they're too loose and they're chasing after Chad, Zeus, Thundercock, not settling down with like a decent guy. So you see the re-emergence of one man, one woman as the social norm because people like it who are relatively successful, and the top tiers of society, the top 20%, like monogamy with their one good woman and their one good man and so on. And then the lower quality people look at it and their attitude is always the grass is greener on the other side of one man, one woman, or sexual looseness. They because they just kind of suck at it. They suck at life, so they're always looking for like, oh, it's this. No, it's the opposite. Oh, it's that. No, it's the opposite. Back and forth, because they're always suffering and they're always knowing it. They don't like it, so they're trying to change it. And they do that through social pressures and activism and like trying to change people's minds and so on. And women happen to be very able to be convinced of emotionally charged, not logically sound, and disadvantageous things if the person talking to them is confident enough, somewhat. It's not always the case, but you know what I mean. It's relative to men a little more often. And that's why the effeminate thing, the effeminate man, who's all crying and emotional and weak and vulnerable and all that, does what they do, and why they have to toughen up if they want to have any chance to reproduce with a woman and have children to carry on their legacy and genetics. So when the high status people return to monogamy, then you begin to get a cascade effect of copycatting in the lower orders of women following the leaders of the high status men and so on. And that's how you get out of the slump of a dysfunctional dating market and so on, and broken families and so on. And it's why it happens. And what's more is during the process of the dark ages of dating, the weak men basically don't have children, so they just die off en masse without having children. Which keeps the genetic lines fit from a very Mother Nature is cruel mistress kind of perspective. But it works. It's a self-inflicted wound by the weak men, biting off more than they can chew by loosening the morals of spreading the wealth that is women, access to women for the purpose of having children, basically. Now, the thing is, physical strength is not the only strength. There's also mental strength and there's also drive. So there's smarts, there's brains, muscles, and drive. There is, on average, compared to before, a move towards more and more smarts and drive and less need of big muscles in a sense. Although that is still a selection marker for women at times. And I'm going to include character in smarts for a moment, for a while, because I have a concept called social technology. And basically, what that means is social technology is the information that we keep going and knowing about and advancing and making more complicated, but still relative, like exists in reality stuff that is relevant to day-to-day life with humans. Mechanical smarts is logic and puzzles and literal mechanics or digital equipment or electricity or like fire or like metalworking or farming or something like that. It's like, it's like that's what I'm going to call mechanical technology. Um, One of the things is an example of how technology can perpetuate itself even if it loses access to the things that built it up in the first place is meat and fire. Humans have used fire to cook meat for so long that we've lost mostly the ability to withstand whatever it is in red meat that makes us sick if we eat it raw. But you notice we work to keep our standard of being able to cook meat, to eat it, very consistently. Social technology is similar. And basically, this is what people fear in the apocalypse, in a way, is the aftermath and the destruction of technology and so on, lost knowledge of civilization and so on, dark ages and so on. And basically, basically, one of the things that's real that people are worried about is if we lost access to our deeper mining, like our deep mining techniques, we wouldn't have the resources available on the surface of the earth to build up again so that we could go back to the level we're at now, much less a higher level. But you notice how that doesn't actually necessarily happen. It's sort of happening with the loss of manufacturing in the West and so on. But I'm talking on a total humanity-wide level. Anyways, there is another evolutionary thing going on, which I want to get into, which is autism. Now, basically, autistic people are stable, but they sort of follow the same selection pressures as men in a way, but it's a little more statistically stable. Um, so you have the bell curve. And if you've ever seen the bell curve, you know what I mean. Look it up if you haven't. It's really important for society and like evolution and statistics and like when you have big numbers of things, how they're going to divide up, basically. The IQ range of autistic people is it is a bell curve in a way, but there's more people relative to the normal bell curve on the very low intelligence autism and the very high intelligence autism. The average autistic IQ is actually 2 or 3 points higher than normal people. So basically, so basically, you have people who can easily master mechanical technology, but are not naturally socially smart. They don't have the instinct for social smarts. However, with the advances of social technology, we are able to teach autistic people to be better at social things. And I don't know if this is exactly true, but I'm going to assume it is for the sake of demonstration. So that you so that you get an idea of what I'm talking about. Let's say the average autistic social units starting in the Stone Age was 7. It could be 5 now. However, let's say the maximum social units autism can get to is 25. And let's say the normal person is 10, and they can end up as 20. So it's a slightly squished, but you start ahead, but you have less potential in the end. So you have socially weaker, social technology weaker, or social weaker, but due to social technology, they can advance higher than the other people, and they are better at mechanical technology, naturally. Do you see why autism could be on the rise evolutionarily? And basically, if we lost all our social technology and all our mechanical technology, And we reverted back to sticks and stones and caveman paintings and so on. Basically, all the autists would die off except the ones that start at 7 and have like a 140 IQ instead of start at 5 social units and can only get to 15, let's say, even social units and have like a 110 IQ. There would be a collapse of autistic people surviving and passing on their genetics. Because as we grow in mechanical and social technology, the potential becomes more important in a way than before when it was the starting point that mattered more because we couldn't develop as much in our lifetime. We didn't have the knowledge on how to do that. Yeah. But you notice how I said that the autistic people would squish more towards normalcy? So instead of 5, they'd have 7 social IQ to start with when normal people start with 10. And maybe they, maybe, maybe the 7s can go to 20 and the 5s can go to 15 and the 10s can go to 20. Social units of strength. But the mechanical IQ might be like 140, or the social technological IQ could be 140. Basically, just IQ could be 140. Instead of 110, because if you're 110 and you're not socially strong, you'll die. There's the possibility that we're technically losing selection pressure for raw intelligence. However, on the flip side, in the opposite direction, is the fact that we're living and breathing a more technological society that's more complicated and counterintuitive, but still works. So you require the IQ to keep stable or even increase overall over time as we have technology. And what might be a downturn in raw IQs for the moment could be part of the downturn in cycles of evolutionary fitness that I already explained in terms of strength, smarts, and drive in general, with the lack of one man, one woman stuff. And what this means is on average, our brains, even with the easiness of life, because the women are picking smarter and smarter men who are just as strong almost or only slightly weaker and a lot smarter and just as driven basically, you can see the pattern that's emerging from what I can tell here. And that includes social smarts, social technology, mechanical smarts, mechanical technology. It could be either or, it could be both, but it's also got drive and you have a little bit of muscle keeping going that was already developed. And the smarts are increased because the women are catching up to the men forever, evolutionarily, in terms of raw individual capabilities. On average, there's always outliers. And basically, there's two types of relationships with knowledge and people. There's cunning and there's wisdom. Cunning is knowledge you benefit from hiding from others. Wisdom is knowledge you benefit from sharing with others. Women, being naturally weaker, are more cunning. However, cunning starts strong and decays and weakens in power over time, the more you use it, basically. Wisdom starts small, but grows in power more and more quickly the more of it you get. So men use wisdom more so. However, men also, why are women supposedly not funny? Because they aren't naturally selected for it. But what does that mean? The answer is humor is a way of a man demonstrating that he understands the woman, or he understands cunning, and is showing how cunning he can be without being hostile. So it's a sort of demonstration of your mental fitness in understanding women, and also having something that you can use on occasion, an emergency clutch, game-saving action when something puts you on your back foot, when your back's to the wall, and so on. Which means you've got sort of a Super Saiyan, go 150% power for like 10 seconds kind of emergency skill, a limit break, going beyond the limits temporarily, which is a useful skill to have due to various reasons about the chaos of life and so on. However, the primary mode of a man is wisdom. And what the man does for the woman, because the woman trains the man in cunning, the man stabilizes the woman and grows her, cultivates her with wisdom. And also, this is why women will talk crap about each other behind their backs and then smile in front of each other to each other. Whereas men will talk shit about each other and maybe punch each other and then make amends and so on. Because it's literally cunning versus wisdom as the primary mode of operation. Initially. Now, as Jordan Peterson pointed out, young women with not good fathers will have difficulty understanding the difference between a man who is confident because he is cunning or mischievous or malicious. He just doesn't care about anyone else. That's why he doesn't care about anyone else. And he's confident. He just thinks about himself as good. Builds a certain sort of confidence in a way. But that's the bad boy in a way, right? You don't want to be a soy cuck either. But the bad boy is the danger one for the woman. And all the romance novels and stuff, and 50 Shades of Grey, and Milking Farm, and so on, show that archetype in full power in women's imaginations. Because it's a fetishized version of a confident man who cares about other people, which is the primary mode of wisdom for men. It's what truly attracts a woman in the end. The bad boy can do it, but the confident, strong man who's kind and generous can do it even better than the bad boy. And keep the woman, which the bad boy can't. But the soy cuck doesn't get the woman in the first place. So nice guys finish last. Now, this is not necessarily related, but I'm going to add it to the video anyways because I think it's super helpful for approaching the life and that stuff like that when I'm doing my unified theory on all sorts of things. And this is a faith thing. This is faith. This is a relationship with a person who is trying to grow you into a good person who enjoys life. First step of masculinity, at least, or the first step, this can work for men and women basically, but I'm sure their exact expression type will be a little different based on whether they're a man or woman. First level is always active. Second level up, one up, is the first one you develop after you got rock solid the first level. So it's like a pyramid. And the third level you put on after you've got the first and the second level secure. So you're building a pyramid upwards. So what is the first level? The first level is I am good, I am bad, so I do good, I do bad. The second level is actually two concepts at once. It's I could be twiddling my thumbs, doing nothing good, nothing bad, and God will just give me a little treat because He loves me. The other concept on the second level is I can be trying to do something and I can kind of see how it works and like figure it out mostly, but there's just something about it that doesn't work, and I see it doesn't work and I don't know how to fix it. And then like God will meet you halfway and He'll make that thing change into something that you go, oh, I know how to do it all the way now, all of a sudden. Like all of a sudden, basically. Or like you won't know at all if it'll work, but you kind of think it might work, and then you do it, and then you look back and go, okay, I never predicted that, but like that made it work from things I didn't plan out. Like when I planned something out and I tried it, it worked, and now I see, looking back on it, how it worked in ways that if God had not have made work that way, it wouldn't have worked at all. So that's like the level most people who are faithful get to. And the Calvinists of Christianity actually have a third level, And I think Catholicism has the first and second level in a way, and Calvinism has the third level, but they don't explain how to get to it. So I'm going to explain the fullness of the Christian traditions and so on, and how I've navigated all these different denominations: Baptist, Orthodox, Calvinist, Catholic, and so on. The third level is when I do good, God is working through me. And by the way, you don't move up a level and abandon the previous level. You keep the first level, then you build to the second level with the two concepts. Then you build to the third level, and you can collapse the top part, you can collapse the top two parts. Just get back to rebuilding it in your conceptualization and understanding of that style of situation and so on, if you can. So if you have to temporarily sacrifice something because you don't know how to make it work fully with all three levels being right at the same time, sacrifice God working through me temporarily and try and get back to it. And if you have to sacrifice that one, and the God does things for me even when I don't deserve it, and also God will help me get success if I put in the effort, He'll meet me halfway. Those two concepts is like the second level. You can collapse the top level, then that level, but you always keep I do good because I'm good, I do bad because I'm bad. Because the negative level is bad things just happen to me and there's no explanation. I'm just a victim. That's a negative level. That's the basement where the rats are. And what you'll notice is as you progress, you get better, but also you give the credit to something other than yourself that is higher. And that's why it's important to have the first level, the second level, and the third level building upwards. So you don't sacrifice the foundation. You sacrifice the cherry on the top first, then the icing, then the cake part, the actual like red part of the cake is what you keep no matter what. Otherwise, it's never a cake. You're just negative. Which is the whole I'm a victim thing completely. I mean, you can, I guess, kind of say I'm a victim in a way, but like you should really. It's kind of like using cunning as a man. It's kind of like you maybe it's okay in an emergency in a way, you know, and that's what we call true victimhood when you're like actually a victim, like someone like just randomly shoots you or something, or sexually assaults you or something, especially as a woman or a child. But you want to avoid that level if you can possibly do so. In fact, you want to build upwards as much as possible in any given situation in your relationship to it. And by the way, being better, getting, like, being better and focusing more on God as an other, acting through you more and more, is in fact Jordan Peterson's onward, right? And upward. The upward is the good part. The onward is the other, the destination. And the other means like another person, which happens to be God in this case. Because God will never fail you, because He's God. I mean, even if He does fail you, He's not actually failing you, is a good way to look at it. With this model in mind of those three levels and maybe the negative level too. And by the way, this is also what Bishop Robert Baer means when he says you're caved in on yourself, when you're focused on your own desires and you're sinful and you're focused on sinning. And it's like you're smaller than you were before because of it. It's all related to how we talk about these things. And honestly, for this relationship with the world and so on, you do actually need to give the source of the universe and the ordering principle of the universe the identity of a person. I don't know if it's... I mean, I've had experiences that make me think it's like objectively a person, but like, even if that's just delusional, it kind of works anyways. And like, I don't know, maybe there's something about humans where we need to treat the ordering principle of the universe as a person who's perfectly good in order to like even mentally unlock our conceptual systematizing powers. But no matter how you divide it, I'm pretty sure it actually is necessary to act and treat and think that the ordering principle of the universe and its source is a perfect and good person. Like, it might be a life hack, it might be magic, it might be science, it might be an archetype. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what language you use to describe it in terms of like trying to explain it away as a person. It actually works doing what I said, basically, in my experience. So yeah, that's my total unifying theory on all this stuff.